on the topic research problem formulation. Basically, before starting any topic, I prefer starting with a framework which gives an idea as to what exactly we are going to cover in this particular session of 1 hour and 45 minutes. So basically what we are looking at is 5 different aspects I want to cover during this topic on research problem formulation. It begins with identification of research opportunity. How do we identify research opportunity? Which in turn has got two parts, which I'll go into details. One is the broad area. How do we identify the broad area of research? And secondly, we speak about what kind of contribution our research is going to make. When you go for your PhD, one of the important criteria when the research and recognition committee approves your topic for PhD, one of the most important criteria that we keep in mind is whether your research is making contribution to the body of knowledge or not. So that is the first point, identification of research opportunity, which is a part of research problem formulation. Having identified the research opportunity, then we go on to identification of research gap. Whether there exists a gap in research which can be filled through my research topic. Thereafter, we try to link the broad area of research to the research problem. So what is the linkage between the broad area of research and the research problem? This gives you clarity about not just the research problem, it gives you clarity about, to some extent, what kind of research design will be required, although that is a separate topic altogether. That is followed by formulation of research problem. How do we formulate the research problem? And a subset of that is formulation of hypothesis, which must be a separate topic in your PhD coursework, but I'll just touch upon it as a part of research problem formulation. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes,
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
And the
sir.
slides are
Yes,
also
sir. Audible.
yeah. Okay. Now, what is important and not to be forgotten is in all these stages of research. In fact, this is just the first part of first component of the entire research process. Research problem formulation is just one component of the entire research process, which comprises 7 different steps. All these 7 steps, especially the entire research problem formulation stage, will have literature review intertwined. So you cannot say that literature review takes place at one particular moment. Literature is something which you keep on referring back again and again, because at every stage you will have to fall back on literature to have a greater understanding about what kind of research I'm going to conduct. So let us start with identification of research opportunity. How do we identify a broad area of research? Some scholars have done work exclusively in this area. To guide us, how do we choose the research problems? How do we choose the research opportunities? The starting point is something which puzzles us intellectually, something which is intriguing for us, something about which we are confused. That becomes the starting point of any particular research. For example, the Dean of Harvard Business School, the then Dean of Harvard Business School, Professor Nitin Nohria, who is incidentally an Indian, the current Dean also is an Indian. Professor Nitin Nohria, while has been teaching management in one of the best business schools in the world, was intrigued by something which was, he thought that we do teach a lot of management tools and techniques, starting with downsizing, total quality management, re-engineering, Six Sigma, and whatnot. We talk about all those things. And then a question rose in his mind, and that was, do these management practices really work? So this intellectual puzzle, this confusion, this is the starting point of conducting a research. So he continued research in that area. Of course, that was not his PhD research, but that became a very important research output. So starting point of any research is first identification of a broad area of research. So here the broad area of research, from where did he identify? It was something which was intellectually troubling him. Do management practices really work? I have been teaching it for a long time, but do they really work? So that is the starting point of research. Another starting point of research may be, sometimes we see a gap between what we teach in theory and what actually is practiced. Or maybe something which is being practiced, but we have a counterintuitive feeling about it. We feel that I'm not convinced whether this works or this doesn't work, or I'm not convinced the way we teach it. So that is counterintuitive in my mind. And that becomes the starting point of some kind of research. In my own case, what happened was, in last 10 or 15 years, you must have also heard the term emerging markets. Although there is hardly any consensus as to which countries constitute emerging market. As less as 40 to 45 countries, the number goes up to 150 countries or so. What exactly constitutes emerging markets? On one hand, you have India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka. On the other hand, you have countries like Brazil, Russia, China also as a part of emerging countries, emerging markets. And because these emerging markets offer huge opportunities to marketers of different products and services, so naturally it has attracted attention of the scholarly community also. A lot of people have written research papers, articles on strategies for emerging markets, on marketing strategies for emerging markets. As a student of marketing, I had a counterintuitive feeling. On one hand, we say that these are the strategies for emerging markets. On the other hand, it was counterintuitive to me that China and Russia, which are far advanced countries as compared to a Pakistan, as compared to say Sri Lanka, or to some extent India also, do these countries, even if we classify them together as emerging markets, can we practice same kind of marketing strategies in all these countries? So any research paper which talks about marketing strategies for emerging markets, does it become valid in all kinds of emerging market countries? So this question occurred to me. Are all emerging markets alike? And this was the beginning of a research project for me. And that's where I wrote a research paper, which, which resulted into development of conceptual framework for marketing strategies in emerging markets. But this was the starting point. So I realized that there is a gap between theory and practice as far as emerging markets are concerned. What we are looking at is, how do we identify the broad area of research? Third possibility. Sometimes there is some phenomena which has become very popular, and we want to understand what is the structure underlying that phenomena. What are the functions underlying that phenomena? Like, for example, in Maharashtra, we have an annual religious, or you may call it as a spiritual practice, where from various parts of Maharashtra, especially two holy cities of Maharashtra, which are very near Pune, Dehu and Alandi. From these holy places, processions start in a particular month on particular days, as per Hindu calendar. And these processions ultimately go to a very religious holy place called as Pandharpur. These processions in Marathi are called as waris. Lakhs of people year after year have been attending these waris. These waris are as old as almost 800 years. Now, to a researcher, there might be a question. What is the structure underlying these waris? What are the functions which are performed during these waris? How is it that So many people, lakhs of people come together. Who holds them together? Who keeps them disciplined? What kind of functions are performed? What kind of structure emerges? When we talk of organized sector companies, there are various departments. You have the operations department, you have the purchase department, you have the materials department, you have the quality control department, you have the sales department, you have the finance department, you have HR department. Even when there are 500,000, 2,000 people working. Whereas here, this wari has been going on for more than 800 years. Every year, lakhs of people congregate and in a very disciplined way, they march from one city to another city, covering hundreds of kilometers. So what kind of structure is holding these waris together? I may become intellectually puzzled by this, and this may be a starting point for my research. Basically, what we are discussing is how do we identify the broad areas of research? Another way of identifying broad areas of research is a social problem, something which may not be a problem faced by an individual company. It may not be a problem faced by an individual organization or an individual. It may be a problem which is faced by the society as a whole. Like, for example, somebody might be disturbed by the fact that all those people, or instead of saying all those, many people who are working in IT companies, they work long hours, they work in different shifts which match with the time zones of America or Europe, and their routines are different from the normal routine of a human being. And for other reasons also, they face a lot of stress, especially in last few months, because of a lot of high-tech companies laying off people. These stress levels might have gone up. So you might be interested in probing this research, this social problem, why the stress levels are high among IT professionals. So this may become your area of research from which you will derive your research problem for your PhD. Then there are three more possibilities for identifying broad area of research. Some new development takes place at social level, or maybe technologically some developments take place which result into some research opportunities. Of late, in last 3-4 years, there's a lot of talk about e-vehicles, e-cars, e-scooters. Now, because of this new technological development, and once this technological development is accepted by the society, once the e-cars or once the e-buses or once the e-two-wheelers become popular, then different kind of social issues also might arise. And you might be interested in pursuing research in that area. Like, for example, how will e-vehicle affect the auto ancillary industry? Because a lot of components which go into making of a two-wheeler, which go into making of a car, will not be or are not required by a e-vehicle. I started my career from Bajaj Auto Limited, and in a scooter, hundreds of components go into manufacturing. There is something called as IC engine. Inside IC engine, there are several components. Now, if there are not going to be a particular IC engine in an electric vehicle, all those components are not required. So all those companies which are making these components and selling it to Bajaj Auto Limited or selling it to Hero Motors or selling it to Honda Motors or TVS, what happens to this auto ancillary industry? This is a technological development which results into social problems also. So if these auto ancillary companies do not survive, then what happens to the employment in those companies? So this may become a research problem for you. What will be the impact of electrification of automobile industry? Particularly automobiles, if they get converted into e-automobiles, then how the auto ancillary industry gets affected. This is a broad area of research from which you may derive your research problem. If you are lucky enough, somebody may approach you with a problem. Like I am basically an academic, got converted into a consultant. While I was a lecturer In 1996 itself, I started my consulting practice, and slowly in 2015, I got full time into consulting, and now I go only as a visiting or a guest faculty in some institutes. Now, somebody might approach us with a typical problem. Like, for example, how should e-taxi companies like Ola and Uber handle the fraudulent practices of the drivers? Some of the drivers, and all of us have experienced this, some of the drivers, after booking the car, once they talk to you and you let them know that this is where you want to go, they cancel the trip. And this, the company wants to say, for example, curb. And they approach you and they want you to guide them, they want you to advise them. So this is a problem which is brought to you by some sponsor. He is ready to pay for it. From this, not exactly this, but from this, some part may become a broad area of PhD research. Or sometimes your own personal experiences which you undergo in life, they may be starting point of some research. Like, for example, there was an assistant professor at Harvard Business School. She was a lady. Her name was Laura Roberts. She was African, black, and she felt, reality or not, we don't know, she felt that she was being discriminated upon. She felt that this discrimination may be because I'm an African, because maybe I'm black, or maybe because I'm a female. So being a female, being African, or being black, these are determinants of her social identity. So she started trying to understand whether there is a link between social identity of a person and that person's professional image. How social identity affects interaction among different people who come from different social identities. So this became a point of research for her, and she wrote beautiful research paper on this, right? So the point is, what we are looking at is, in our framework, we are looking at how to identify research opportunities. For identification of research opportunities, we start at the macro level, a broad area of research. And you must have seen all these 7 ways of looking at research areas, they originate actually in your mind. So all these research problems are not out there externally, they are there in your own mind. All these research problems originate in research, in researchers' mind. When I say this, what exactly do I mean? We are all the time gathering information. Sometimes we are doing it actively, sometimes we are doing it knowingly, sometimes we are doing it passively or unknowingly through all our 5 senses. Now, whatever I am speaking, all those people who have logged into this session and who are watching this, who are listening to this talk of mine, they are collecting some kind of information through eyes and through ears. Through all our 5 senses, we are all the time collecting information, maybe actively, maybe passively. All this information which is collected through these 5 senses is then processed by our brain. On the basis of this, we perform what is called as shallow or unconscious thinking. So we see a salesperson and we see that the person is very talkative, or we find that the person does not hold any inhibitions. He doesn't mind coming out and talking to you, madam, can I take 5 minutes of yours? Whereas you don't find many people having that kind of trait. And then these two pieces, here is a salesperson, he is talkative and he does not mind getting himself introduced. You connect these dots, this connection of dots is a kind of shallow thinking that you have performed, and you create a theory. That theory is what? theory, this theory is explanation of a phenomena. You are explaining to yourself that salespeople are generally talkative, they are extrovert, and they have very low inhibitions. This is a personal theory which you have created in your mind. But when you test these kind of personal theories through systematic research, then you create what I call as general theories, which can be taught to students in the classrooms, which can be taught to managers or executives in the companies as a part of management development programs. You are not supposed to teach just your personal theories which are not tested. So what research does is the information which we keep on collecting, on that information, we perform some shallow unconscious thinking and create our personal theories all through our life, right from morning till evening, till we go to bed. We keep on creating conjectures. We keep on connecting the dots and say, if this is this, this is that. Like, for example, you might say that teachers are generally very sober kind of people. Now, this is they are not very flamboyant kind of people. This is a personal theory which has not yet been tested. So what you do is, this is a problem which has originated in your mind. This is a research problem which originated in your mind. That is what I have shown by red color. Now you start research on that and create general theories so that later on it may be taught in the classroom. That is what we mean by contributing to the body of knowledge, right? Now, when we look at the research problems, whether to approve that as a PhD problem or not, PhD question or not, we apply certain criteria. One of the important criteria is this research contributing to the body of knowledge? Contribution to the body of knowledge, how do we judge? We judge it on the basis of to what extent general statements can be made from this research. To what extent generalization can be done from this research. You will be doing your PhD research in one particular area, maybe in one particular sector, in one particular geography at one particular point of time. Now, the findings of your research, are they applicable in at least in that sector as a whole, or are they applicable only to the sample which you have studied, or only to the kind of company which you have studied, or only to small number of people? Then the generalization across the space, we call it as space, across the space is very low. Second question which I will ask is, the research which you have carried out in 2022-23, is that research applicable? Will that research findings, will the research methodologies, the findings be applicable in 2025 also, 2030 also? That means across the time, whether the findings will become generally applicable. So as the examiners of PhD research problems, we look at to what extent your research is generalizable. And generalizability we judge across at least two domains. One is the space. Means you have done research in one area, at least in that area, to what extent that research is applicable. Is that research applicable in different areas? We call that as spatial variation. How much of spatial variation is accounted for in that research? Similarly, the research has been conducted at one point of time. To what extent those findings will be applicable 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the line? Somebody at some point of time came out with the idea of, in marketing, what we call it as marketing mix, the 4 P's of marketing. In case of services marketing, they call it as 7 P's of marketing. Now this idea, the original idea of 4 P's of marketing, the original idea of marketing mix was developed long ago. Somewhere in 1950s, 1960s, it was elaborated. And still today in 2023, 2024, we keep on teaching that. That means this idea has generalizability over 70, 80 years. That is why we come to the classroom and explain some ideas of marketing using this framework of marketing mix. So that is what we expect from the PhD researchers. To what extent the spatial variation is covered, to what extent the time variation, which we call it as temporal variation, is covered. A research topic may have very low spatial variation being accounted for. That means only in certain areas, very narrowly defined areas, that research is applicable. So the spatial variation is low, or some researches may be applicable across sectors, across type of people, across type of geographies, across type of organizations, across scale of organization. In that case, the spatial variation is high. Some researchers may be applicable at certain point of time. They may remain valid for a year or so. That's it. So the temporal variation is very low. Some researchers, their findings are valid over a long period of time. That means their temporal variation, which is accounted for in that research, is very high. Naturally, this results into four quadrants. Quadrant one, where the spatial variation accounted for in research is very high, the temporal variation accounted for in the research is very high. That means you do a research today in a particular sector and its findings are applicable across many sectors. Its findings are applicable over a period of time. This is the ideal quadrant. This is the ideal quadrant, which is normally preferred as researchable topics. So choose such researchable topics where the generalizability across sectors or across time is high. If not across sectors, at least in quadrant two. Maybe the findings are applicable only in a particular industry. Say maybe only automobile industry. It is not applicable in other industries, fine. But at least it is valid over 10 years, 20 years, and that kind of thing. That is across the time zone. Or some research findings have very high level of spatial variation, but are applicable at only particular point of time. Like for example, pandemic. So in situations of pandemic, COVID was one pandemic. In situations of pandemic, this is what happens across the countries. So it is applicable across the countries only in pandemic period. So temporal variation accounted for in that research is low, but across the, so quadrant one, quadrant two, and quadrant four are ideal zones where research problems should be located. Quadrant three is the ideal zone for practitioners. Practitioners are interested in here and now. If I'm working for a company like Flipkart, then I'm interested in issues concerning Flipkart today, or maybe for a certain period of time. So I'm interested only in quadrant three. So, but that does not become an ideal PhD topic. PhD is more interested in creating general theories. So this is something which you need to keep in mind. We had accounted for this idea of generalization in one of our research papers. Another point that you need to keep in mind is when you carry out your research, you are expected to write research papers. Research papers should flow out of your research. Now, what kind of research papers are accepted by the journals? All this is linked to the kind of research problem that you choose for conducting research. Two criteria which a journal will apply while looking at any research paper. Minimum two criteria. One, how rigorously the methodology was followed. Whether the methodological rigor is high or whether the methodological rigor is low. And the problem which is being studied in that research paper, whether that problem is relevant, whether that problem is important, significant or not. whether the relevance is low or whether the relevance is high. This gives rise to again four quadrants. Ideal research proposals are those where you are working on problems which are very important for the society, which are very important for the practice, which are very important for the theory, for the academia, and where you use good sound research methodology also. These are the ideal proposals. Then sometimes you may have research problems which are very relevant, which are very interesting, but the methodology is not very good, but not bad also, acceptable at least. Those are the problems which fall into this category, which are which I have labeled as may get accepted. So these also are research problems which will get accepted because we believe that the knowledge gets built incrementally. Somebody will revise the methodologies, bring in greater rigor, and then that problem will be restudied. You might bring the problem up to certain level, somebody else will study it further. Third level is where the methodological rigor is very high. Some very high statistical, high sounding statistical methods like structural equation modeling and all that you are using, but you are using it on problems which are not of much relevance, or the problems on which a lot of researches have already happened. And as if the impression is getting created as if the researcher is just trying to use some statistical methods. That's it. Those are the problems which I have shown with orange color. They have low probability of acceptance. You cannot sell a research problem as a PhD problem just on the basis of your argument that I'm going to use this XYZ methodology. And of course, the problems which I have shown by red color, they are neither very relevant nor the methodology is good. So ideally, you should be going for problems which are relevant and where you have sound research methodology. Problems which are relevant, the methodology, I won't say not acceptable, but there is further scope for development. At least those kind of problems will get accepted. So these are some of the things which you need to keep in mind while choosing your research problems. So for choice of research problems, first you need to identify broad area of research, about which we have already discussed how to identify broad area of research. Second question that you need to ask is, will my research make contribution? And how does a research makes contribution? A research makes contribution by understanding three aspects of research. You can understand what kind of contribution that research is making. What is the nature of contribution? What is the scope of contribution? What is the context of contribution? We'll go into details of each one of this. Let us start with the nature of contribution. As I told you, first you need to choose a broad area in which you would like to do the research. Having identified a broad area, then go on to check whether your research will make contribution to the body of knowledge or not. First thing that you will check is what is the nature of contribution you are going to make. One can contribute to the body of knowledge in three different ways. One may expand the theoretical knowledge base of that particular domain. The theoretical limits of that knowledge you may expand. You may expand the theoretical base of that knowledge domain. And that is what is your contribution. Or second way in which you can contribute to the body of knowledge is you may introduce new methodology. You may not introduce any new theory, but new methodologies of measuring something, new methodologies of conducting research. That also is a contribution. The third possibility is that you are not adding something new, new theoretical dimensions you may not be adding. You may not be adding new methodology, but you might be applying the existing theory and the existing methodology in a particular new area where research has not taken place, where you are basically trying to generate the data. That is more of applied kind of research. So these are three different ways in which you can expand the boundaries of knowledge. Ideally, ideal research topics are research topics which, while generate some data, they basically expand the theoretical boundaries of the knowledge, or they make methodological contribution to the body of knowledge. Now, there is a whole lot of confusion about what exactly is theoretical contribution. And this term is misunderstood largely. That is why I'm giving an example from a movie which was very popular by the name Munna Bhai MBBS. In this movie, the villain, which was a very famous Hindi movie star, Sanjay Dutt, he was the hero, and the villain uh, was the dean of the medical college. Very interestingly, this person, the star, he is not actually, he gets into a medical college by using fraudulent means. And he prescribes all kinds of things which are otherwise unscientific. Like, for example, he says that if somebody is suffering, then you give him a jhappi, you give him a hug, and the person will feel better. Now, I'm looking at it purely from the scientific angle. Now, if you ask that person that if you give a hug to a person who is not feeling well, how is it that he starts feeling well? He does not have explanation of that. Whereas if you ask the same question or similar question to Dr. Asthana, who was portrayed as a villain in that movie, the Dean of Medical College, that you are asking to give a particular medicine to a patient who is having high temperature, and you ask him to give, say, Dolo 650. Then can you tell us why the temperature of the body goes down? He can explain what kind of chemical reaction takes place in the body because of which the body temperature goes down. This explanation of a phenomena is the role of theory. Try to understand, theory is what? Theory is a system of explaining a phenomena. It has various components. Theory has got certain concepts. Like, for example, market expansion strategy is an idea. Performance of the company is another idea. Market share is another idea. You may call these as concepts. And you connect these concepts and say that there is a positive relationship between market expansion strategy and financial performance of a company. So when you connect two concepts together, you create what is called as a proposition, or you create what is called as a hypothesis. And several propositions and hypotheses put together create a system of explanation, which is called as theory. Not everybody creates a theory. Some people work on only one part of theory called as principles. Principle is, it is just one explanation of a phenomena. Like, for example, if you have more than one superiors of a person working in an organization, if a person has to report to more than one bosses, then that person's efficiency and effectiveness in functioning will go down, because he is likely to get confused whose orders to follow. This is a principle of management called as unity of command, which says that if you have more than one superiors of a subordinate, his functioning is likely to get affected. That is called as a principle. So your research output may generate certain principles. Your research output may create some metric. Metric is what? It's a measure. Net profit is a measure. Return on investment is a measure. Net worth is a measure. Profit is a measure. Profitability is a measure. Customer satisfaction is a measure. Brand equity is a measure. So your research may develop some measure, which is called as metric. Your research may come out with some framework. Using that framework, you may explain certain phenomena. Your research may come out with some model. It may be a mathematical model or maybe a non-mathematical model. So all these are the theoretical contributions. So the point is, what is theory? Theory is explanation of a phenomena. So a research paper or a PhD thesis will be making theoretical contribution only when it is explaining some phenomena fully or partly. That you have to be very clear in mind. Otherwise, we might say that we are making theoretical contribution while we are actually not explaining any phenomena. Some researches can make different kinds of contribution. I had told you that three types of contributions are possible. One is you may make theoretical contribution. Second is you may make methodological contribution, or you may make contribution in the form of generation of data. Let us take an example. Somebody does a research on demand sustainability. I did my PhD research on market expansion strategies. How do you expand the market for certain products? Rather than increasing market share of a company, can we expand the total market itself? That was my research. And later on, a thought came to my mind that you generate a new demand for a product category. And that new product category whose demand you have increased after a certain period of time, maybe 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, the demand for that product category goes down and some new product category takes over. Like, for example, we earlier used to have pagers. Now, in place of pagers, we have got mobile phones. So the demand for pagers vanished and the demand for mobile phones went up. Now, once you have expanded market for a product category, once you have created demand for a product category, what needs to be done to sustain that demand can be next area of research for someone else. I did my research on market expansion strategy. Somebody may take it further and say that I would work on sustainability of demand. Here again, three possibilities. Somebody may do a research which makes primarily theoretical contribution, and his research output would revolve around defining what exactly constitutes demand sustainability. That is theoretical contribution. Somebody may contribute methodologically, like he may measure what is called as experience curve effect. Experience curve is more you repeat certain things, more the experience you gain and lesser is your cost, which ultimately may lead to reduction in prices of the product category, which may help you in sustaining the demand over a period of time. So one part of this entire phenomena, which is just experience curve effect, how to measure that experience curve effect, you may devise some methodology for that, and that becomes your methodological contribution. So broad area of research is demand sustainability. You may choose to make theoretical contribution by just defining what is demand sustainability, what it is not, or by measuring the experience curve effect. The method of measuring the experience curve effect is your contribution. Or somebody may not do either of the two, neither theoretical contribution nor methodological, but he uses the existing theories, he uses the existing methodologies and creates some data. Like, for example, at what production level benefits of economies of scale and experience curve effect get negated. These are two different ideas. One is called as economies of scale. More the volume you produce, lower is your cost. Second concept, experience curve. More you repeat something, which is not necessarily volume led. Less is your cost. Now, somebody may use the existing theory of economies of scale, existing theory and methodologies of measuring the experience curve effect, and then check at what production level the economies of scale and experience curve benefits which you get, those benefits get neutralized. You may do this comparison between two sectors, automobile on one hand and fast moving consumer goods industry like bath soaps, etc., shampoos, etc., on other hand. So in this case, you are not making any theoretical contribution, methodological contribution, not major theoretical or methodological. Existing theory, existing methodologies you are using to generate data in certain sectors. That also is a kind of contribution. Basically, what we are discussing is when you think in terms of contribution, three dimensions of contribution. One is the nature of contribution, about which we have discussed: theoretical, methodological, or data driven contribution. Second dimension of contribution is scope of research. What is the scope of your research contribution? 8 possibilities. One is you may create something new. There's an idea in management called as disruptive innovation. Now, what is disruptive innovation? Disruptive innovation is that an innovation which takes place at the lower end of technology, at the lower end of the market. Generally, when we think of innovation, we think of upgrading the products, upgrading the markets. So if you had lower end versions, you come out with higher end version, higher and higher end version. Whereas some company may come out with deliberately lower end version of an existing product. Its performance might be at slightly lower level, but it might be priced at a level which is affordable by such market segments which otherwise would not have bought that product. And as a result of it, the market gets disrupted. This whole idea of what is disruptive innovation, conceptualizing that itself is a research. You have created a new theory. That is all. That is one scope of your research contribution creation. But not every research can create something new. Some researches just modify the existing perspectives. Like, for example, there is something called as balanced scorecard. Now, I will not go into details of each and every idea, otherwise we'll take a lot of time. There's something called as balanced scorecard, which is used for assessing performance of companies holistically by looking at various dimensions. Now, this is something which is used in corporates. If somebody thinks that if I have to use it for measurement of performance of a university, then how to do that? So he's not creating something new afresh, he's just revising. So that also is a scope of contribution. Somebody may just describe an idea, a construct, or a concept in detail. Like, for example, in our country, there is a lot of talk about demographic dividend. There are 50% of our population is less than 30 years of age. And we say that this is demographic dividend. Now somebody details out this idea, different facets of it. That also is a type of research contribution. Somebody, what he does is he neither creates something new, neither revises nor details out, but he looks at various researches being done in one particular area only. And from those researches, he tries to take out themes. He tries to develop a framework out of it. He tries to draw certain conclusions that based on 50 such researches, we can say this. That is called as a summarizing kind of research, or that is also called as meta-analysis kind of research. That also is one of the scope of research. Somebody may prove that what was earlier considered to be similar is not actually similar, it is different. That means his scope of research is to differentiate two phenomena which earlier looked similar. Like, for example, in psychology, somebody may do a research and say that depression because of family problems is different from depression because of work related problem. And he may come out with differentiating criteria. That also is a research contribution. Somebody may combine two or more views, two or more different perspectives, and integrate something to explain an existing phenomena. Like, for example, somebody might say that if money is the main motivator, why do people join military where a lot of risk is involved? So financial or economic perspective does not explain this fully. There might be certain other perspectives also. Let us combine those perspectives and come out with some explanation. So you are integrating. That also is a kind of research contribution. Sometimes some research has been done and it is acceptable at some level, but beyond that, there are certain questions. You probe those questions and see whether the findings of that research still stand or withstand. That means, can you reinforce the findings which somebody else had found? Like, for example, in some countries, somewhere, research showed that ownership of pets, dogs or cats, or maybe some other animals, ownership of pets improves happiness. Somebody might say that this was a research done in X country. Can I replicate the same research in Y country? Or somebody might say that this was done on a small sample. Let me enlarge the sample and see whether this research findings still remain valid. So you are reinforcing the research findings, which also is a research contribution. And last, very difficult type of research, but a research which really contributes in a big way is called as challenging, which is you prove something as unacceptable which otherwise was considered to be acceptable. Like, for example, for admission into India's premier management institutes like IIMs and some other colleges also, there is an exam which is conducted called as common admission test. Some people believe that not only common admission test, but in US also, the exam which is used for admission into management institutes, GMAT, they are heavily quantitative. And as a result of it, engineers tend to be dominating these exams. And somebody might say that doing well on quantitative test is not the good criteria for selection of managerial potential. So somebody may challenge something which is well accepted. It is well accepted that CAT is a good test for IIMs and other premier management institutes. GMAT is a test used by various institutes in US. So somebody may challenge by doing research. So that is the second dimension of the contribution. First was nature. Second is the scope, and third is the context of contribution. In which temporal or spatial context you are conducting the research. At what point of time this research was conducted, and then you make an argument that the times have changed. Like, for example, this was a research paper published in a journal by IIM Ahmedabad, Vikalpa. This research paper talks about how finance teaching and research has changed after global financial crisis. They are referring to 2008 financial crisis. Now, the authors of this paper will have to first convince the editors, the reviewers, that something changed in 2008. That means the context after 2008 is not the same as the context before 2008. So the temporal context has changed. So that is why my research paper or my research is making the contribution. Or somebody might say that a research has been done in one domain. I am doing the same research, but in a new domain, like, for example, the role of knowledge management initiatives in organizational effectiveness, innovativeness, empirical findings in the context of IT industry. Somebody might say that role of knowledge management has been studied, but in which industry? They might say that it has been studied in consumer electronic industry. They might say that it has been studied in pharmaceutical industry, but has not been studied to that extent in IT industry, just for the sake of argument. And then they say that this space, IT space, is different from pharmaceutical space. So the context of contribution is different. So finally, when I combine all these three dimensions together, then there emerges a framework. That framework is, as a researcher, when you are choosing your research problem, you have to be very clear, will my research paper or will my research topic make theoretical contribution? Will it make primarily methodological contribution, or will it just apply the existing theory or methods? And in doing so, will I be creating something new? Will I be revising something which already exists, or will I be detailing out, and like that? These are the different scopes. And finally, will I be replicating any of these in different time context or in different spatial context? You don't have to write like this in your thesis. You have to think like this. Frameworks are basically to guide your thinking. So whenever you think of research contribution, think of three things. One, what is going to be the nature of my contribution? Theoretical, methodological, or empirical or applied. What is going to be the scope of my research and what is going to be the context of my research? So first part of our framework we have discussed, that is, how do we identify the research opportunity, the broad area of research and the research contribution. Two subparts we covered in that. Now coming to the next point, and that is identification of research gap. Having identified a broad area of research, how do we identify the research gap? One scholar by the name Swells, he came out with a model for creating research gap. He suggests that a researcher should first identify the broad area of his interest or her interest, broad area of research. Within that, he should first establish why that area is important, why that area is relevant. Then that person should look at the research which has already happened in that area. What is the existing research in that area? And then finally, the researcher should see what are the gaps which exist. That is what he called it as create a research space model. Now let us look at it with the help of a case study of one of my research papers, which we published in Journal of Strategic Marketing. Now in this paper, what was our broad area of interest? Our broad area of interest was marketing strategies in emerging markets. So when we write the research paper, we have to first establish that that is an area which is important. That is an area which is relevant. So in first few paragraphs of our paper, this is what we had written. That according to World Bank, the world's population will rise and all that. And 90% of the population will be living in emerging market nations. What I have shown with blue color here are the references. So based on these works of some other scholars, we are trying to establish that this topic, marketing strategy in emerging markets, is an important topic. So first identify the broad area of interest, and in that establish the importance. Then you study the literature. So we studied literature. In the literature, what we found, which we have mentioned in the research paper, emerging markets have attracted attention of not only corporates, but also marketing scholars. And whenever I say something as a part of research thesis or as a part of research paper, I have to provide evidence. So whatever I have written in bracket with blue color, those are the evidences. Other scholars have said this, on the basis of which I have concluded that emerging markets are attracting a lot of attention. If that is the case, then where exists the research gap? The research gap, then I concluded on the basis of all this, me and my co-authors, we concluded that most of the research papers, most of the studies investigate strategies in single country context. So they pick up India and do research there, and they say that this is generalizable to emerging markets. They will pick up a Latin American country like Peru, and then they will say this is applicable to emerging market. So these are all studies which are applicable, actually carried out in single country context, and we are trying to generalize on the basis of that. And in this research paper, we said this is the research gap. Further literature survey showed us that emerging markets do have some common characteristics. And we, on the basis of the literature, we did find that emerging markets do have common characteristics. So it's not as if there's nothing common among the emerging markets. But what we found was that, again through literature review, however, as I have shown here with underline, not everybody agrees that all emerging markets are similar. Again, we are providing evidence for that. The 4 billion people that constitute the low income segment in these countries are not a monolith. They are not similar. They are not homogeneous, right? So then we concluded on the basis of this entire literature review, we said we believe that a generic framework for strategic marketing in emerging markets should be based on one hand on some such characteristics that are common to most of the emerging economies, and on the other hand should accommodate heterogeneity across emerging markets. There are different reasons for heterogeneity. One reason which we picked up in our research paper was we add a large population as one such characteristic of emerging markets, which is common, and yet it adds some different flavors to different markets, right? So this is how you need to do literature review and identify the research gap. Now, when you do the literature review, as a scholar, you should be asking 5 questions. First question is, if I'm reading a paper, then I should be asking myself why this topic was studied, because this will help me in answering the question, why should my topic be studied? That will help me in turn in laying down the objectives of my research. This is something which has already been studied. This is something which I propose to study, and that is why these are my objectives. What has been studied in a particular research paper, where it has been studied, when it has been studied, and how it has been studied. Then I ask questions, what should I be studying? Which will help me in identifying the variables in my research. Where it has been studied and where should I be studying? That will help me in defining the scope of my research, the spatial scope of my research, which sector, which geography, which segments of people I should be studying. When it has been studied, that will help me in answering the question, when it has not been studied, when should I study it? Temporal scope of the study. Not necessary that every research will address both. And finally, how a particular research paper studied that particular phenomena and how do I propose to study it? That will give me insights about the methodology. So when you probe these 5 questions, why, what, where, when, how, to various literature which you have studied, then you will get answers to the question of objectives, variable, spatial and temporal scope and methodology. In effect, you are identifying the research gap. That is, you are answering the question, why is my research required? If the answer is that everything has already been done in the previous research, then there is no research gap. But that generally doesn't happen if you do literature review carefully. Now, when you present your research gap, you need to offer justification as to why do you feel this gap exists and why is that gap relevant. There can be variety of justifications which you can come across, Maybe you will find that a particular issue which is very important but has not been adequately covered in the literature. It has been covered in the literature, but the discussion is not adequate. Maybe some people are giving one kind of theoretical explanation, some other people are giving another kind of theoretical explanation. Like, for example, Maslow says that, Abraham Maslow, the psychologist, he says that there are 5 different types of needs. Although some people attribute hierarchy to him, he never claimed that there exists a hierarchy. But somebody may come out with a different set of needs. And you as a researcher will then say that theoretical approach 1 and theoretical approach 2 are conflicting, and I want to resolve that conflict, and that is why there is a research gap. Maybe there is a conflict in the empirical methods, the data collection method or the context which is being used. 5, 7, 10 different papers are showing something which is contradicting each other. Empirical results might be mixed, or the contextual or geographical representation is not enough. Something has been done in Europe, but not in India, not in Southeast Asia. So I want to do it, right? So these kind of justifications are needed. So in our framework of defining the research problem, first thing that we discussed was about how do we identify the research opportunity, the broad area, and what kind of contribution we are going to make. Then identification of the research gap. Thereafter, we need to link the broad area to specific research problem, for which we need to again ask various questions. What phenomena I'm going to study, why that phenomena I'm going to study, and how that phenomena I'm going to study. This will help you in formulating research problem very systematically. Let us look at again a case study. This is a research paper which was published in one of the leading research journals in marketing called as Journal of Marketing. Why do customers get more than what they need? That means these researchers were intrigued by some facts. How the research problem was formulated. This is not the way it is being put in the research paper, but I can apply this framework and imagine as to how they might have thought about this research problem. They might have asked the question, what is that is puzzling me in this research area? What do I want to know better? What are my key research questions? So in this research paper, they have mentioned the case of certain brand of car, very high-end luxury car, in which they said that there are so many features on the dashboard of the car that many of the drivers, many of the passengers, many of the owners of that car, rather than getting excited about those features, get confused and at times get irritated also. So that is what is puzzling the researchers. And if this is confusing, then why the companies are giving so many features? So what is puzzling them? Why that will be of interest? So if we do a research on it and publish it in some journal, why will it be of interest? Then they had to do some literature review which convinced them that yes, over provisioning or over designing of the products is a problem. Even smartphones have so many features that sometimes we wish that a simpler version at a lower cost would suffice. That is where disruptive innovation comes. So what is puzzling me? Over provisioning or over designing of the products. Why should that be of interest? Because there exists a market for simpler products. How will I study this as to why companies over design the products? So what kind of conceptual framework I am going to use? That how part. How part second, How I'm going to use it methodologically, what methods I will use for collecting the data. So when you have these questions being answered, you are slowly moving towards clarity about the research problem. So for example, in this particular case, level of product capability decision. That means what kind of product capabilities should we design? So whether a car should have those many features or not. So they did some literature review and they found that ideally how we should design the product should come from the study of the needs of the customers. But they say, however, even casual industry observation reveals otherwise. That means many companies over design the product. So this is where they have answered that first question. What we are studying? We are studying the phenomena of over provisioning by providing variety of evidences, right? Why should it be studied? Overshot customers. Overshot means I require something of X level and your company is giving X plus plus and charging me more, and I'm getting confused and irritated. Then these overshot customers who consume a product but are not pleased and even frustrated, these customers, they are, this kind of situation is not good for your company. So there exists a research gap. What is that research gap? One phenomena which they are two concepts which they are trying to connect to create a phenomena, and that is on one hand over designing of the products, over provisioning, and on other hand culture of an organization. Is there a link between organizational culture and over designing tendencies? How will they do it conceptually? So now you are saying that organizational culture, we are going to connect to the product capability decisions. Means design engineers of your company, how will they design the car or dashboard of the car? That depends on what kind of culture your company has. Among many factors, one of the factors is this. So this has become a conceptual framework. Conceptual framework means it gave you a direction to think, it gave you a direction to plan. Otherwise you are all over the place. So organizational culture, it has got a framework called as competing values framework, which defines four different types of cultures. Now we are not going to details of that. So basically what they are trying to study is, if a company is having adhocracy kind of culture, then is there a link between this type of culture and the kind of products which it designs? If the company has market culture, then what kind of designing practices it follows? If it has a bureaucracy culture, then what kind of practices it follows in designing of the product? If it has a clan culture, then what kind of practices it follows and all that? And what are the other factors, right? So we are still trying to collect the broad area of research to the research problem by answering what is to be studied, why it is to be studied, how conceptually it is to be studied, and finally, how methodologically it is to be studied. What kind of methodology? What independent and dependent variables we are going to use in the study? So these researchers said, when you want to link the type of culture to the product capability decisions, then which one is dependent and which one is independent? Dependent is how do you design your product? So perception of the product capability is dependent on what kind of culture the company has. So company's culture, its dimensions, they constitute independent variable, and the manner in which the company designs the product and the manner in which it is pursued by the outside world is the dependent variable. Having this clarity right at the stage of formulation of the research problem saves you a lot of trouble while doing your PhD. Otherwise, if you have not thought about all those things initially, then it will take more time and you may get stuck. So right at that stage itself, you should understand what kind of dependent and independent variable will be involved in my research. Where will I get the scale items? All these things you as a part of your PhD coursework will get covered in methods of data collection and all that. From where will I get the scale items? And what kind of source will be required for that data? Data about what kind of culture a company has got. These researchers thought that this data will be available from the companies which make the product. But what kind of products the company has made, the perception of it, they said for that, we will have to study the customers of that company, not the manufacturers, right? So all these clarity connects the broad area of research to the research problem. Now we come to the last but one part of our session, which is formulation of the research problem or definition of the research problem. But the first three steps are key prerequisites without which you cannot define the problem. Problem definition in turn has got four subcomponents, which we'll see one by one. Objectives of my research, scope of my research, at what level I am going to slice the data, at what level I'm going to do the analysis called as units of analysis, and finally what kind of variables I'm going to use in the research. And very briefly I will touch on the issue of hypothesis because it is a integral part of your problem definition. But hypothesis, otherwise formulation and testing of hypothesis is a separate topic itself. Now again we will look at a case study, my own PhD journey. How did I formulate the research problem? So as a teacher of marketing, as a student of marketing in India, I always had this intellectual puzzle that we all the time present marketing as a battle, marketing as a war. Two companies are fighting over a slice of the cake, as if the market size is fixed, as if the size of the cake is fixed, and the only battle is who gets the largest slice. On the other hand, when I looked at the data about what percentage of people own a particular type of product, what percentage of people use how much quantity of product like bath soap, toothpaste, tooth powder and all that, then those percentages and those quantities are nowhere in comparison to the developed countries. On one hand, we are assuming that the market cannot be expanded and every company has to fight for only market share. On the other hand, we see that a lot of people still don't own a car. A lot of people don't own a two-wheeler. A lot of people don't own a TV set. A lot of people don't own a refrigerator. I'm talking of the time when I did my research, right? And a lot of people use bath soaps, more than 90%, but how frequently? How much quantity? A lot of people use detergent powder, but how much quantity as compared to developed markets? That is much less. So this was a kind of puzzle in my mind. Theory says that market share you should target, whereas the real data from the field says that there is still scope to expand the market itself. So I started studying the literature in various areas, 9 different theoretical areas in which I started studying the literature. Upon studying the literature, I identified 5 different types of research gaps. First research gap was there was no conceptual clarity about what constitutes market expansion, particularly in the developing market context. What exactly is market expansion? Conceptual clarity was not, it was fuzzy. Second, people said we follow market expansion strategy or we don't follow market expansion strategy for XYZ reasons. The academicians had their own thought processes. People like me would think that most of the companies don't follow market expansion strategy because the managers themselves come from elite background and they do not understand the reality. That was my thinking. But what exactly are the reasons? Did I validate those opinions of the managers? That validation, I did not find any literature on that. Next, there was not systematic probing of routes to market expansion in India. If somebody wants to expand the entire size of market, means TV market as a whole, out of that, who buys Samsung and who buys LG and who buys Videocon or who buys Panasonic is not of interest to me. What was interest to me was somebody who did not buy a television, how can we make him buy a television? Whichever brand he buys. So I'm not concerned about market share, I'm concerned about the market. So what are the methods of expanding the market? That was the third conceptual, that was the third research gap. Fourth research gap, if a company follows market expansion strategy, how is its performance linked? That study I did not come across. And finally, there was no existing metric measure to capture a holistic view of market expansion strategy. How can I say company A is following market expansion strategy and company B is not following, or more of market expansion and less of market share? What is the mathematical measure of it, or maybe some other measure of it? So these were the research gaps which I identified. Broad area, marketing. Within that, market expansion, literature review, research gaps identified. These research gaps resulted into some phenomena in my mind. I'm just notionally presenting it. One phenomena which I had in my mind was consumer product companies focus on market share gain rather than expanding the market. Why is it so? Most of the consumer product, this is what I felt. So when I look at this phenomenon and I want to study it, I need to break it into concepts. So the concepts were: one, market. What is a market? Second, what is market share? Third, what is market expansion? Fourth, what is market expansion strategy? Fifth, what is the product category performance? Company performance is different, product category performance is different. Samsung is doing well or not, I am not much interested. Samsung's TV as a product category, on that, how the company's finances are, whether the company is making profit on TV or not, that is product category performance. So these were the concepts. Now, a few concepts you put together and you create proposition, and when you test it, that becomes a hypothesis. So one of the propositions which later I tested it as a hypothesis was, there were several. There is a positive relationship between market expansion strategy and financial performance of a product category. So I started with an assumption based on some research, not just based on what I thought, that there is likely to be a positive relationship. Means more the market expansion strategy you pursue, greater is the performance of that particular product category for which market expansion strategy has been pursued. And on the basis of these propositions, I could have thought of developing the entire market expansion strategy related some theory, some explanation, which I could do, and that is where we could publish some papers in international journals. Now, how did we formulate the objectives? We identified the research gaps. We converted research gaps into objectives. One of the research gap was there was lack of conceptual clarity. The first objective of my PhD thesis was to develop a conceptual framework. Second objective was to study reasons for and against choice of market expansion strategy, because these reasons were not systematically studied in literature anywhere. There was a gap. To understand methods used for market expansion, because systematic study was not there. And finally, we wanted to understand, to examine the relationship between market expansion strategy and corporate performance at product category level. These were the objectives. But as you will see, broad area of research, research gap, from which automatically the objectives flow. It cannot be reverse. Then we also need to define the scope. Where will I do this research? Two areas. First, consumer products. Within that, consumer durables. Then non-durables also, because I wanted to compare durables and non-durables. Non-durables are bath soaps, detergents, etc. Durables were TV, refrigerator, etc. and two-wheelers. But there was a qualification which we applied: such consumer durables and non-durables which can be bought by middle and lower income classes in India, because the scope for expansion existed there. not in the upper middle or the upper income segment. So that is how the scope was defined. Now, when you will sit down to define scope of your PhD thesis, at least three dimensions you will have to keep in mind. Which objects you are covering in your research. That means which products you are focusing on, which activities you are focusing on, which phenomena you are focusing on, what people or what kind of organizations you are focusing on. That is one dimension of your scope. Second dimension of your scope may be spatial dimension. Which geography you are covering, which segment you are covering, which sectors you are covering. Third dimension of your scope may be time. Which year, which month, which days, which season you are trying to study. So not necessarily that every research will have all three dimensions, but in general, when you define scope, these are the at least three areas in which scope needs to be defined. Now let us look at one of my PhD student who unfortunately could not, whom unfortunately I could not continue as I moved out of the full-time academics. But when we defined her research problem, which was about effect of celebrity endorsement in social advertising in rural Western Maharashtra. This was the research. How the scope was defined. Geographical scope was rural Western Maharashtra. We were not looking at urban markets. Western Maharashtra because we had limitations of the time and effort and the money available. But rural areas, we were not interested in urban. Second, what was the sampling element within that rural Maharashtra which we are looking at? Means the people whose opinions or views or whom we were to use as respondents, people who are above 18. Mind well, we are not saying male or female, adults only. That's it. Within the scope, we further define celebrity endorsement when we say what type of celebrity. A politician is also a celebrity. Are we covering him? Elon Musk is also a celebrity. Are we covering him? No. We defined very clearly two celebrities. One is a movie star and second is a sports person. So you narrow down the focus of your research so that it becomes manageable. And finally, when you say that you want to study the effect of when you have a movie star in an ad and when you don't have a movie star in an ad, when you have a sports person in an ad and when you don't have a sports person in an ad, then how it affects the effectiveness of the advertising of what? Two social services we chose, health related and hygiene related. If there is an advertisement about polio, polio drops to be taken. If you have a cinema star, mega star like Amitabh Bachchan in the ad, and if you don't have Amitabh Bachchan in the ad, whether the effectiveness of the ad changes. What was the methodology used and all that, I'm not going to details of that. The point to be covered or the point which I wanted to make here is you need to define the scope when you are formulating the research problem. So objective scope. Third point, when you are defining your research problem is at what level you are going to perform the analysis. To put it simply, the findings of your research will be applicable for company as a whole, or will they be applicable for specific departments? When you say that these findings are applicable to small and medium scale companies, that means your unit of analysis is entire organization. When you say that these findings are applicable to the production department of various companies, then your unit of analysis is a department, not the entire organization. Or when you say that these findings are applicable to the supervisory level employees, not the managerial level, then your unit of analysis is individuals. Or when you say that the findings are applicable to the CNC machines, computerized numerically controlled machines, then your findings are about a specific object, right? So you have to be very clear in your mind where your findings are applicable, at what level you are analyzing the data. To make it more clear, I will quote another case study of my own research paper, which was about market expansion strategy and performance relationship. Based on my PhD, we published this paper in an international journal. We calculated a market expansion score for every company for a particular product category. 30 companies we had covered in this research across India, right from Delhi to Bangalore, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Pune. On the basis of survey of these 30 companies, we had designed a scale, which we abbreviated it as MarkX. Then we did some mathematical analysis, and what we found on the basis of this statistical analysis was that there was a positive correlation between market expansion strategy efforts of a company for a particular product category and its sales revenue growth. There was also a positive correlation between market expansion strategy efforts of a company at a particular product category level and its profits. But when I examined these relationships in non-durable category, this was fine in two-wheelers, this was fine in TV, refrigerator. But when I studied it in bath soaps, when I studied it in detergents, I did not find that relationship. What I found in case of non-durables, the relationship between market expansion efforts and sales growth, not sales revenue, was only positive. The relationship between market expansion efforts and profit was not significant, and that was negative, although insignificant. That means more the market expansion efforts a company spends, less was its profits. So these were very startling findings. The assumptions with which I started and what I ended were very different, and that is what research is all about. You don't have to start with fixed mindset. You have to check your own mindset. Now, in this research, how did we define the unit of analysis? First, as I said, Samsung was one of the respondents in my thing, but we were not interested in Samsung as a whole. We were interested in only Samsung TV. Product category of consumer product companies in India during a period of 2005 to 2008. Right? So that is how you define your unit of analysis. Finally, my analysis is applicable to product category. So these findings are applicable to TV. That does not mean they are applicable to microwave ovens also. One has to be very clear when you are trying to publish your research findings. Last point in formulation of your research problem is you need to define dependent and independent variables. If you get confused, instead of calling them independent variables, you may call them as influencing variables also. What are dependent variables? The variables on which you want to study the effect, and the variables whose effect you want to study, they are the independent variables, which you may also call as influencing variables. Like, for example, if I am doing a study on prickly heat powder, the brands which are famous in India, Nycil, Dermicool and all that, Boroplus and all that. So if I am trying to study market share of various brands, then market share is a dependent variable. Various regions of India is an independent variable. Then in my analysis, I try to connect these variables. Means I'm trying to see, instead of looking at market share in totality of Nycil, Dermicool, Boroplus and other brands, if I break it into independent variables, or to make it simple, in influencing variables, then I can check, is there a significant difference between the market share between north and south, east and west and all that. That means I can, with this kind of table, understand whether the regions influence the market share. So the region becomes the independent variable and the market share becomes the dependent variable. All this needs to be thought of how you are going to analyze the data in the research problem formulation phase itself. One last point related to research problem definition is sometimes you are dealing with some ideas which are at the concept level or they may be at the construct level, which are not tangible, but you are doing research on it. Like for example, some Chinese scholars did a research on relationship between political connectedness of Chinese companies and work safety. That means they wanted to study if a company is politically well connected, then does it have relationship with the safety practices followed in that company? Now, in that case, political connectedness is an abstract idea. How do you decide whether a company is politically connected or not? How do you measure the work safety practices of a company? That needs to be operationally defined. Like for example, so these are two variables. Extent of safety is a variable which needs to be operationalized. How? They, in their research, calculated average number of deaths per 1,000 workers. So if there are 1,000 workers in a company, within one particular year, how many workers died because of accidents? That was the extent of safety, measure of extent of safety as far as that research is concerned. More abstract was whether a company is politically connected or not. How did they operationalize it? They said a company which has at least one person in the top management. Then they define the top management, which may be board of directors of the company or vice president level and above people. At least one person in the top management of a company which has senior level experience of working in the Chinese government. For just for interest, I will tell you their findings were startling. What they found was companies which were politically connected, they were more prone to following unsafe practices of production. Maybe because they were not worried. If something goes wrong, we can manage. That is what they thought. Because we have political connections, right? But then to do this research, political connections had to be operationalized. All that you need to do as far as your research problem definition is concerned. Now the last part. Once you have formulated the research problem, you may be required to develop the hypothesis. How is a hypothesis generated and all that? You will have to study it in detail. I'll just give you an overview as a part of research problem formulation. Let us look at this research paper, again picked up from a very prestigious journal, Journal of Marketing, #1, rated #1 in the world. This research paper deals with a very peculiar phenomenon. The phenomena is expressed is like this, that in some companies, B2B companies, the companies which are into industrial marketing, selling some products which are bought by the industries. The authors, they found that, or they thought that these companies, when they have the marketing department, this marketing department generates certain leads of prospective buyers, and they pass on these leads to the sales department. But many of the leads provided by the marketing department are not used by the sales department. This created that puzzle in their mind. They were intrigued. Why is this happening? The phenomena has to create some intrigue in your mind. So they wanted to investigate this phenomena. How did they formulate the hypothesis? First and foremost, they used a conceptual framework. They said the sales leads, whether are provided by the marketing department or whether are generated by the salespeople themselves, that depends on three factors. One is the ability of that sales representative itself, which they operationalized, saying sales representatives years of experience, 5 year, 10 year, 15 year, whatever, and sales representatives past experience in which industry. So ability was one factor. Motivation of that sales representative as far as that lead is concerned. That means whether the sales representative thought that the lead which he got from the marketing department is pre-qualified well or not. Whether the quality of that lead he felt to be good or bad. And second motivation for him was whether somebody is going to ask the question later on that I had provided you 20 leads. What did you do? How many of them that you follow? And finally, opportunity. How many leads are provided by marketing people? If more leads are provided, then what happens? If less leads are provided, then what happens? Connecting all of them, connecting these different facets lead to hypothesis. Like, for example, one hypothesis which they generated, 1A hypothesis which they generated, connecting motivation to lead follow. As the pursued quality of pre-qualification process increases, the proportion of time spent on the follow-up of marketing leads also increases. Simply means if the salesperson feels that the marketing department gives me good quality leads, then he tends to follow it up. That you will have to test in your PhD research. H5A, as you can see here, ability, motivation, and lead, a combined relationship. The positive effect of managerial tracking of marketing leads on the proportion of time spent on the follow-up of marketing leads decreases as sales representatives' experience increases. What I mean by this? Here, motivation is used as an independent variable and lead follow-up is used as a dependent variable. The researchers are saying that there is a positive effect that if the managers track whether the leads which was provided, whether the sales representative has used those leads or not, if you are going to track that, then the sales representative is likely to do the follow-up on it. But that follow-up will change among the sales representatives. All of them will not behave in the same way. This is called as moderating variable. It will be moderated by the sales representatives' experience. More experienced sales representatives are not bothered even if somebody asks the question later, right? So this is how the hypothesis needs to be generated using a conceptual framework. How do you formulate the hypothesis? First, personal theories. So these researchers, based on their observation, based on maybe when you teach in executive MBA programs or when you conduct management development programs, you interact with the people at middle level or top level, and then you come across all these conversations on the basis of which they might have created a theory in their mind that leads generated by marketing department are not used fully by the salespeople. On the basis of that personal theory, they carried out what is called as exploratory research, or everybody has to carry out exploratory research using literature review, secondary data, case studies, etc. These are different methods of conducting exploratory research. So personal theories, your observations, exploratory research, on the basis of which you create hypothesis, one part of which is called as alternate hypothesis or research hypothesis. Second part is called as null hypothesis. Now what it is, that will be covered in the topic on hypothesis, right? Now last, when it comes to a good research problem, there are 4 qualities which you have to keep in mind. What is a good research problem, especially for a PhD? First, it should fill a research gap. Something on which you should be able to prove that research gap exists. Second, it should be an area of relevance. It should be an area which will be of importance, at least to practitioners or to academicians or to society or to government. If it is an area which is of relevance only to one particular company or one particular dealer or you only, then that is not a PhD problem. It should contribute to the body of knowledge. Contribution in terms of nature, theoretical, methodological, or data you should be generating. Contribution in terms of scope, you might be creating something new, revising, detailing, differentiating, integrating, etc. And contribution to the body of knowledge in terms of context. You will be doing research either in new time period or in new space, new geography, new segment. And finally, the topic should be researchable in terms of data. This is practical issue. You have identified a very good research topic fulfilling first three criteria, but the fourth criteria, where do you get the data about competitors or competitors' views? You may not get data on that. Or sometimes it is infeasible in terms of efforts, time and money. Like for example, I was sitting on research and recognition committee of some university. And there was a student who was trying to do a PhD scholar who was trying to do a research on some new government law or government scheme, sorry, which was enacted in 2018. And he was proposing this topic in 2020, saying impact of this scheme on the success or failure of entrepreneurship. The question which we raised in research and recognition committee was just 2 years this scheme is in force. 2 years is too short a time to decide whether an entrepreneurial venture has become successful or failure. So how can you research this topic, the linkage between that scheme and success or failure of entrepreneurship? So that is how you need to have a topic which is researchable in terms of data. And finally, do you have the wherewithal for the efforts, time and money which is required to do that particular research? So these are the qualities of good research problem. That's it. These are some of the references which I have been using for this session and you might find useful if you want. I'll share the abridged